Welcome tonight. I have, you see, even darker.
No, more like.
Yeah, the back, do you have a spotlight of any, like that little white one that you can bring in and put on me? But we'll go with what we have because it's just plain time. Oh, that's much better than the view over here. So we have stuff all over the place. We have computers, we have cameras, one tripod, we have cords going all over the place. And it's just it's taken a couple minutes to get things arranged. So tonight, what I have to show you is a little itty bitty bowl. It's 3 inches in diameter. It's 1.5 inches tall, all plus or minus about 1/8 of an inch. And the cross section of this is something that just has pretty graceful shape, fairly uniform wall thickness, and a nice little foot at the bottom that allows it to stand very stably and just have a cute little look. The quest is to create 150 of these, and that means doing it efficiently. There is no sense going through this and taking a lot of time. These have to be done in a pretty efficient fashion. After working on about halfway through them, I was very happy when I could do the outside in 10 minutes. And then I did the inside in 10 minutes. And the best record so far is about 6 minutes for each one. And about every 10 bowls, I have to sharpen the tools. There's another 6 minutes. So that cuts off a little bit. But we're now down to somewhere right around the high 2s to 3 of these pieces per hour. Forgetting about all the setups and things like that, but just cranking through the pieces. So it starts with a chunk of wood. This is beech. It came from a special tree at the Miss Porter School. And you can see that it has distortions to it and such, but it really doesn't matter much. The steps will be to mark the center. This is rectangular, so if I mark the center, I have to mark 4 different directions using a center finder, which is still at my shop, so I can't show it to you. So I'm a guest here in Roland's shop. And then we drill a hole in the middle. Now this hole is about 1 inch deep. What's most important is that it's about 5/8 of an inch thick between the bottom of this piece and the bottom of this hole. And when you look at this piece, you can see that it's a 2-inch hole that is a little bit smaller than the mouth opening here. It's dropped down so that right about where my fingernails are is where the bottom of the drilled hole is. So that's important for me because I'm going to use this hole with an expanding chuck to mount this piece. But in the second stage, the little mark at the very corner, the square corner at the bottom of this hole, is my target mark for making the curve. So when I cut from down here, I'm going to cut an arc all the way down, and I'm going to target the bottom of this hole. And then I'm going to pass through it and continue the curve and not go too deep in the bowl so that I get this profile. And the thickness is there. Don't have a thickness gauge. Maybe we could get one and measure these two, which I haven't done so far, but maybe we're way off. Right, so I am a big fan of extremely simple tools. And here is the depth gauge with a little red mark on the pencil. It's a piece of scrap wood with a hole the size of this pencil, a couple of slots cut in with a handsaw. And I rapidly discovered that every pencil manufacturer uses a different diameter. So this is for a Ticonderoga pencil. Don't try to put another one in here. I have about 5 pencils in my bag that won't fit in this. But this makes for a very nice depth gauge. And you can see that this is off because it's set so that the red line can be read on the outside, not the inside of the hole. It's a lot more convenient. Let's see how close this one is. I get approximately 1/8 of an inch leeway in making these. And so that's what I set as the target. It's actually a little bit shy because this is the depth gauge that I use for when I sweep through with the bowl gouge. Check the depth gauge. I take a little bit more off with a scraper. That lets it set in a little bit more. This is a perfectly acceptable one. Now, we're going to check with, it's not a, oh, it is, okay. No, but it goes the wrong way. I need it to flip out because I can't pinch and make the, so I need to be able to measure the dimension.
This is one?
Nope. I want the one that springs out so that I can clamp it and then let it spring out so that I know what that measurement is. But let's take a look at this. In fact, we can do it this way and show that we're really, really close. This one's a pinch deeper than that one, a little bit thinner at the wall. The wall will be a little thinner, I think. So when we set the, yes, okay. So this one has a wheel on both sides, and when I set this, right, so we already sound really disorganized, but I close it all the way. There's just a little tiny bit of wiggle, but that's pretty much the bottom. Slip it on here and go pop. As I predicted from the measurement with the inside gauge, the wall, the bottom thickness is thinner on this one than on that one. This is heavier than it needs to be, but it gives you a pretty good idea of the cross section. So how do we step through this? The blank, mark the center, make the hole. We know that the depth of the hole or the thickness of this bottom is crucial to being able to proceed nicely. The unfortunate thing with a lot of this wood is that it had a whole bunch of cracks on them. And so I mount this piece and boom, lo and behold, there's a big crack running through it. And so that one gets set aside. But then we get a good one. The next step is to mark the diameter for the foot, mark the height from the bottom of the bowl up to the waistline of the bowl. In fact, on this particular one, the pencil line is still there. It's not finished because, oh, another crack inside the piece. Many of these pieces, about 10% of those that I've mounted, ended up with cracks that were fatal flaws. The mark here is the height of the bowl. So once this is made into the cylinder, I set these 3 measurements. I do it very simply with a ruler and a pencil because it's quick to do. I was going to set up a little jig for it and then found that I could do it with a pencil and a ruler very, very quickly and accurately, and that was enough. So the marks give me the basic shape. I'll undercut here in the base. I'll make a curve on the outside, a curve over here. And here's the piece sanded, so it's nice and smooth. We'll do sanding using an Inertia Sander, which is really quite handy. And here's one that showed a crack on the outside. This has cracks just hidden inside. I look at a block, I don't see a crack anywhere along the line. And a crack appeared on the outside of this one. A crack appeared on the inside of that one. So it's a pretty disappointing when you get to this stage and it has a crack in it and it becomes a reject. But then you get to an absolutely lovely piece, and most of them, in fact, are working very well that way. Now, as a complete aside and completely serendipitous, on this very bench, as I was setting up, I found a chunk of yew that came from a vase that Roland was working on. And it's like he had stolen my design.
He does that a lot.
Now, this was just the bit at the end that got turned down to a little stub and then cut off. But now you can make a bowl of that. It's just uncanny that this is almost the same. You're going to have a hard time drilling that hole in it, so you have to do it when it's a block. But you can do it by another method. In doing this, I just needed a way that was going to be quick, accurate, reproducible, and a lot of fun to do. Because, well, I'll tell you, to get good at anything, make 100 of them. And the process changes a little bit. The first 10 I consider to be an experiment. I start with just a general procedure. And, oh, I modify this and I add that, and I take a little time out of here and I change the way I sand, I change the type of sandpaper, the size of the disc and those things, just so that I can sweep through and sand very nicely. Let's move over to the lathe and start with one of these and make this, and then the outside.
Slug that. No, that was good. You did a great job.
Hey, Rick, do you want to mention the questions through chat?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So during this demonstration, I would like to have people ask questions. We don't, we'll mute you on the Zoom meeting so that if you were to ask the question, your camera would jump to the forefront. Please ask a question through the chat, and Mike, our IT audio-visual camera guy, is going to be monitoring chat, and he will try his best to interrupt me and ask the question, and then we'll get those taken care of as best we can. I put a piece on here because I thought I'd have a chance for a little bit of a trial on Roland's machine, but it's all brand new to me. One of the reasons, I'm just showing you another piece that has visible checks in it that I was going to use as a practice piece. Now, we're just going to go live with the real piece, because it took a lot longer to set up chords and things like that. So here's a chuck that has longer jaws. I think they call it tower jaws, and they fit into about a 2-inch hole. And so this becomes very good for the depth of hole that I need, so that I can use this bottom dimension of the hole as a guide for doing the inside shape, allowing me to do that quickly without having to stop and measure a lot. I can just go right down to
dovetails.
This has it's not a dovetail, it has the slight curve to it and the 2 little rings that one way does, and then the gripping jaws inside that we won't use because we'll be doing an expansion.
That you did it with a Forstner bit.
I did it with a Forstner bit fairly quickly, about 400 or 500 RPM, so as not to overheat the drill. And I'll tell you, doing 100 of these takes a chunk of time, and it's a pretty big pile of chips on my feet by the time I get through moving from this side to that side. So this, instead of the regular jaws, I want to reference this entire bowl around the circle at the bottom of this hole. So if I put it against the face of those chuck jaws, push right on the center, expand the jaws, give it a fairly good snug. I like, instead of busting my hands on a tiny handle, I augment the handle a little bit, and I find it a whole lot easier to work. So now, we're going to use a dust collector because we make a mess and we make a lot of dust. I have to do sanding and have to do it kind of fast. I usually use a HEPA over the head thing, but you'd never hear me. I was going to do that. So let's get this thing going.
We got a question.
Go right ahead, Mike.
Michael Feldman asks, why are you doing 150 pieces? What was the commission?
What was? Okay. I was doing 150 pieces because that's the number the client requested.
Okay.
They're ring bowls for Miss Porter School for graduation. I don't know a lot more about the details. I'm actually doing it through a third-party design company. So we get this thing spinning. Oops. Okay. I understand the switch now. And make a cylinder. I have less white here than when I'm at home, so it feels a little different. Pardon? Focus on. Does that blow it out, or is it okay? It's not too bad. Yeah, all right, how about that? You're okay. That's beautiful for me. All right, here we go. So that's a fairly quick cut. It doesn't even have to be super duper accurate. A quick scraping cut across the face gets me to the point where you have the cylinder that's close enough for the next step. I can easily see the center mark here. If I can't, I just enhance it a little bit, and boom, there's my 1-inch mark. My diameter is, or radius is 1.5 inches. 3 inches is what I'm looking for, so I'm all set. I make a mark at 1 inch from the very bottom, another mark at 1.5 inches from the very bottom. Set that aside. With a parting tool, face the cut in, get rid of the top of it. Now I have the cylinder, 3 marks on it. The entire dimension of the bowl fits right into that cylinder. So now back to the ball gouge, which is a kind of an Ellsworth style. You might be going into a spot that you can't see very well. Like if you can bring us in a little closer, it would be a really big help. Now there's a very, very big concern at this point, and that is that I don't move the tool forward and jam the nice sharp edges into the chuck. So oftentimes, I'll come around this corner and I'll stop just before the end, flip the tool around, drop the handle to about 45 degrees, do a little shear scrape, and finish that part off, and sometimes just drag across to get a little bit of a shear scraping finish on this. I'll come right up to the line, trying to leave it behind, and now that curve, it's not absolutely perfect, but it's really close. And what you'll notice is that I'm cutting against the grain. I can't put the tool in here very easily and do a with the grain cut, but I want to remove the wood rapidly. I'll finish it with a slicing cut with what people mostly call a scraper, and I'll do that with the grain. So all these against the grain cuts don't matter. I tried doing this with the grain and it works, but it's really a lot slower than just wrapping this through. I'll come out right at the pencil mark. I'll nick this corner off. Maybe do it in a couple goes. And now a careful cut from the line along the OC curve. I'll get a little bit of burnishing and a couple kind of, not quite burn marks, but some light burnishing marks and a couple little ridges. And I'm not really concerned about that because I want to go fast. Now I switch to a scraper. And I'm going to hold this scraper at 45 degrees. This scraper has a razor edge that points straight up. That means that this is a slicing cut. It leaves a very nice surface. And I drag around to about there. I usually go through twice just so that I get a very, very smooth surface, except that I don't talk when I'm doing this alone. And let's give that a try. Ever so slight mess there. Now, for a scraper that's flat across the top, this is a 01 steel. It's a very simple thing to make, and it has the burr on it. That burr is pointing straight up and down. This tool can be used on the inside of the curve. I usually don't do it, but I made a mess before, so I'm going to come around the corner, and I'm going to bring this curve all the way up to that pencil mark. Flip it around the other direction. I know a lot of people that are familiar with me suggesting that you work in an ambidextrous fashion, but it's quicker not to, and time matters when you're doing a bunch of these things. I'll come right up, and I will just basically nick across this pencil mark now. And I'm going to be pretty careful to get these walls nice and smooth, but I don't care if I leave a little point at the top of this spot, because there are two places in spindle turning where you never have to be concerned about sanding. The top of the bead and the bottom of the cove. If you have a little flaw there, it sands out very, very simply. So we'll be going through that with an Inertia Sander. And I have a couple different types here. This one has a pad on a 45-degree angle on a very simple bearing holder. And this is one of my absolute favorites. It was a prototype that Bruce Hoover made, oh, good Lord, 18 years ago or so. And so this is a pretty handy one. Notice that I don't have, that I put the Velcro right on the actual spinner of the Inertia Sander, and then I can put various size interface pads on them. And also, when the interface pad gets damaged, I just replace that pad. So, oh, I didn't finish. I didn't hollow the inside here, which I normally do the moment I bring the tool. Well, you'll see when I do the second one. Boom. I hollowed that. I didn't move the tool rest. I'm trying to go pretty fast. It's a little bit squawky. I will now move the tool rest, bring it up here, use the scraper, do a bevel-guided cut with a nice scraper edge, make that nice and smooth to the point where it's only going to take less than 1 minute of sanding, and that will be fine. So I remove the tool rest, pop it down onto the ways of the lathe. I have a stack of 4 pieces of sandpaper, 120 up to 320, and I'll just lightly sand along here, and you will see, oh, noise will come up as we're going to bring a dust collector on. You can see that it's picking up a good bit of dust. There's a little tip at the center, which is always a bit of a problem. So I turn the machine off, put the brakes on. I know I have to do it here anyway. So I use the sanding on this ridge to break the whole system. Align the grain going across. Finish off sanding by hand. That way I get the little tip in the center taken care of. And I do the entire bottom of this sanded by hand with the grain. It's not that hard to do. It's a little bit tedious with a stack of sandpaper. It's a very quick and easy thing to do. This is 180 grit paper. I flip over to 280 grit. Now, I have to be a little careful about what's behind me, but 400 grit behind the 280 is not going to hurt me one bit if that 400 grit scuffs the surface. It just prematurely wears the 400 grit paper. So I try not to do that, but it happens sometimes. Under the 400 grit is 120, and that has to be absolutely hidden.
bottom of that is now done. I set this packet of sandpaper back over here. I go to the Inertia Sander, speed back up. We're running at whatever the top speed of rolling slave is. And I just sweep along this edge, getting all the burnish marks removed, go both directions, finish up with 120 grit paper, sweeping across the top of that bead section, rounding the little peak. A little peak here that I like it to be. So at this stage, I'll do a little shaping with the sandpaper. I'm going to show you a different Inertia Sander, and this has a pad that has a very flexible side. And I like this for the finer grit sandpaper, which I'll typically put right down on the bed of the lathe and jump to 150 grit paper. I can creep right up on the base of this, and I'll leave a sharp edge if I don't round it over. If I slide up the edge, slide up the edge, come on back, swing down to the equator, use the flexible edge of this pad, come around the corner both ways. Because I'm sanding in two different directions, the light reflection off from this sanded surface is bound to look a little bit different top and the bottom. So I want to do very light sanding around the equator part, the widest portion, to blend that in as nicely as possible. 150 up to 180. Well, let's take a quick inspection just to make sure it's okay. Have I left any streaks or marks? And no, it looks really good. So now it's just polishing, which I will do without stopping the machine. Because I'm going so fast, it's a very light touch. And what I will normally do is a quick. That's a cooling blast to bring that piece of wood back down to room temperature or below before I touch it with the next paper. So it wasn't very hot, it doesn't take very long, but it's a good idea to bring the temperature down, keep it as low as possible. If you feel the pad and it's hot, you're in trouble. Up to 320 and that's final. So at home things are a little bit closer to where they need to be for really rapid motion, which is important. When you get a kick out of doing a lot of these, it feels great when you're efficient. Boom. And that's more sanding than it probably needs. Let's see how it looks. Looks and feels great. The entire outside of this roll is covered. Some people have trouble hearing you move it.
Oh, absolutely. But it's.
Back up a second.
Are there any questions?
No, just hard to hear when you were going through.
Oh, I'm.
light. You have a paper towel for that light because it's getting blown up.
Well, we'll turn this one off now. We don't need it anymore. So we've attenuated some of these lights with paper towels, and it helps a lot because the camera has an automatic exposure, and we just have to deal with that. So it's nice and smooth down here. The bottom edge is crisp because as I sanded, I brought the sandpaper out and just brought it out into the air a little bit and didn't round over. And that is it's a wonderful trick to making sharp edges. You know, you can do a really, really good job with the scraper, and then you come in with sandpaper and you easily round things over. If you're careful with sandpaper, you can preserve a crisp edge. In fact, you can make the edge a little bit more crisp than it was that way. Okay, so then the next step is to open the chuck, set this one down, get another one, which is over here, which is supposed to be right here, and that's right. Pop it back on, give it a slight snug, and now tool rest back into place. There we go. Spin it to make sure we're okay, turn it on, and now we'll go through the same process but without discussion, just flying right through it. Now in this case, I said I wasn't going to talk, but I have to. I missed the outside diameter. No one asked the question before, how did I hit the diameter perfectly? I have a spot on the chuck that I aimed for that's at 3 inches OD. When I get to the end, I'll tilt the tool up so it's very inefficient. It puts the brakes on. It keeps me from jamming the wood into, or the tool into the truck doors. Ooh, all right, so much for showing the speedball approach here. Much better. Oh, missed a little bit. This is being done by eye, but after the first couple, it's pretty easy to gauge that. Now we go to the undercut. That's the cut I wanted the first time around. Everything looks good.
Funky on that side, but I think it's going to be just fine. Fingernail test says it's okay. This is beech, and beech is pretty tough wood, even if it gets a little funky. So 120 grit paper on the Inertia Sander, 3-inch outside diameter doesn't matter that much. The flexi tip lets me be very, very gentle. As I remove the bremishing marks, come around, get to the equator or the waist of this piece. Get a little tiny irregularities left by the scraper out. And right up next to the bottom, if you see a couple little tiny marks there, it's hard to tell sometimes if that's dust or a scratch mark. So I stop. See the little difference in the color based on the direction that I was sanding. That will be minimized with the finer grits. There are no scratches worth a problem. So it's polishing from here on in. And the outside is done.
It all looks fine. So then this one comes off, the next one goes on, and over again until the tools need a little bit of sharpening, which is about an hour or so in, and then that's a cup of coffee and a good little rest. You have to take a break periodically.
Rick's got a question from
Shoot.
Roger Wigan.
Yep. Go ahead, Roger.
How many bowls do a set of sandpaper discs pass through?
Aha. So it depends upon what sandpaper. I'm looking for my 4mm Allen wrench, which I know exactly where it lives at home.
In the side of the bowl.
And well, for this particular size of the bowl, anywhere between 3 and 6 bowls, depending upon how much I have to modify the initial surface with the, say, the 120 grit paper. Although the finer grit papers wear out very rapidly if you're rough on them. So when I came here, I know I had that blue handle T 4mm Allen wrench, and I can't get the chuck off the lathe without it. That's your big one.
Well, that's my big one. And is it probably in this box?
Well, it would be
I did see it.
in the other box. All right, now this is embarrassing. Okay, it's going to pop up after we get off of the whole Zoom meeting. But meanwhile, we'll just use the emergency set. Not quite as handy, but very, very handy for right now. So this chuck is set up for doing the outsides, and a second chuck is set up for doing the insides. Now, all right, so there's a much bigger ridge on this spindle than my spindle. And we'll get there. There we go. So this one comes off, and on goes a chuck with wooden jaws on flat plate jaws that have been cut to a 3/8 inch ID so that I can grab the outside, of the bowl with these chuck jaws. And I am missing a little tiny piece. Do you have a little tiny piece of cardboard or something? If you peek inside here, the corners of this, the metal jaws are really sharp. And theoretically, if I put the base against the bottom here, it's just a little bit bigger than the hole there. However, if any, yeah, this, there we go. If I put a little protective pad in there, what I used at home, which fell on the floor, is a little more elegant than that, but this will be completely functional. I can then push the bowl into these jaws, make sure that this is flat right here in the middle, push that in, push on the very center spot so that it's the bottom of the bowl is bottoming out on the metal flat jaws of this chuck. Close the jaws so that they come around and touch on the waist of the bowl. Give it a pretty snug grip, because this is all that's holding it for the remainder of the work on this bowl. But it's pretty slick. So I will now set the tool rest, well, what is 3/4 inch gap on my lathe, which is not here, which is right about there. That should do fine. And on the inside of this, is this going to work? Mm-hmm. I've used a bowl gouge. It's a swept back. It's very close to the David Ellsworth grind, except that the heel of this tool has been relieved so that the bevel is only about less than 1/8 of an inch long, and only that part will touch on the inside of the bowl. So it makes for a very nice smooth cut through this bowl. Now, so that I can see what's going on. That happens sometimes. Not tight enough. I could say I did it on purpose. but I would be lying. And it might be that that cardboard is more compressible than the masonite that I use. So we'll squeeze a little bit more and see if we can get away with this. And maybe I'll just be a little more gentle. So yes, clearly I'm turning with the lathe in reverse. And we have yet another technical difficulty. And that is that it's spinning off because I need a set screw, which is missing in this adapter. Don't worry, we'll have it in a moment. It's like I've never done a demo before. But without the set screw, you can't hold your chuck accurately on the lathe. So this will take care of it. So I had to change, these adapters fit Roland's robust lathe. They don't fit my one-way lathe. And so we just swapped them out here tonight for the first time. Okay, here's the tool. Back in action. It's spinning true. I do a quick reference to see that the rim itself is running true. This extra junk was where I was now. All right, so we're going to slow down and troubleshoot because this sort of happened in the beginning. But I've done 65 of these with virtually no problem. So it does work. I don't know why. Much better. So this may sound like it's a kind of a crazy thing to do, but I open the flute a little bit, get close to the work, roll the tool towards me, pushing down with a lot of pressure so the tool doesn't slide around. Once the tip of the tool is inside that bowl, I can make the curve, make the first cut on the inside. What's a little bit difficult to see is that I'm looking back at this corner, and that's the mark at the bottom of the hole that the Forstner bit left. And that's what I'm watching as I cut the wall. I'm watching the curve, and I want to go right in front of or just slightly through the bottom of that Forstner bit and cut into the bottom a little bit more. Stop there. I now have to check that the curvature on the inside of this is really close to where it needs to be, and it is. I can do that by feel. If you were here, I could allow you to, but you're going to have to take my word for it today. Now I'm going to swap to a bowl gouge, which looks very similar, but the angle is steeper, maybe about 20 degrees steeper. This is a bottoming tool. It cuts nicely across the bottom. I can't cut along the walls because it's too steep. But I can't get a bevel rubbing cut with this tool unless the handle's over here and thus going right through the wall of this bowl. So I have to swap to the tool with a steeper angle, maybe a 70-degree angle instead of 55, approximately. I'll go back to forward. We're doing just normal direction turning. You can see from my hand that the tool rest is a little bit too high. We're going to do it safely and wait for the lathe to stop. That's going to be a little bit better. Cut one more time. Get right to the bottom, not leave a tip there. Get the bottom finish as smooth as can be. Use a scraper on the inside. Same scraper that I used for the OG curve.
you can see I've cut from the middle right up to about this point, cleared the chips. I want to put the tool right back there and start cutting where that pencil mark is and continue the curve. I can do this a lot by feel, but I'd like you to see what's going on. One more right from the bottom. All the way around. Doing this all in one go is a really nice way to do it. Now, can you see some flutter in the rim of this? We've lost some registration there. That's very disappointing. So I'm going to loosen and reposition it a little bit. And we're going to blame that squishy cardboard on the bottom because I don't know what else it is, but it's not a big deal. Because from now on out, from this point out, it's a little scraping and some sanding. So it's running much more true. Bring the speed up to whatever Mr. Robust will give us. Now, you can drop the tool rest. A little sticky rolling.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
But I know that, so I adjusted mine.
Okay,
I was giving it that.
give it a tap. All right, so I let the tool rest drop out of the way. Now I can do the sanding. I do have one little ridge here. I didn't get the perfect scrape. Let's go back and let's scrape that again, because that, if I can scrape that and get that ridge out, then I don't have to use a coarser sandpaper. And sanding is slow, and scraping is more for setting the profile. Sandpaper is for improving the finish. So it takes a stop and a go. It definitely adds a chunk of time to the piece. I don't have to do it too many times. It's still a problem. That's because this is a demonstration. Here's a really good trick. I'm marking the thinnest point in the wall right here with the pencil. Now I'm going to do my cutting in this torus region only. I guessed and I was wrong. I should have just marked it with a pencil. Stuck to that. Even though the sawdust, the tips have built up inside, if I look on the other side, I can see the pencil mark on the clean part of the wood back over there. I didn't go quite far enough. So much more slowly when I'm all alone. And now this last time I'll just scoot over that pencil mark. That's gone. So now we should be ready for a nice controlled bit of sanding. Woo! That time it worked beautifully. Yes. There we go. Mike, can you see that closely enough? Does that look like it's ready for sanding?
It does, yes.
Okay, cool. So now we're going to go to a 2-inch sanding disc system. And this sander is a die grinder that you would think I would be powering with air, but I'm using it just as a bearing and just letting it coast. It's an Inertia Sander. So it's about a $10 tool, and at Harbor Freight now you can get them even cheaper. And the rest of the pipe hardware probably costs as much as this, though it was hanging around, so it's no big deal. So I'm going to put a wavy disc 120 grit sandpaper on here. I have 3 different kinds of sandpaper because it's what's in the box, and it really doesn't matter. Some sandpapers last a little bit better than others, and it would be interesting if people could put in the chat their favorite sandpaper for longevity. So we hear a lot of noise. And a lot of that is that I coated the foam on this with some epoxy because it was getting, the foam is wearing out. And the foam gets soft and squishy. I put too much epoxy on it. It's not really squishy, so I have to give it a little bit of squish and get this foam squishier, and now it will. I have to repair these foam pads often. But now it's behaving quite nicely. So if you haven't tried one of these, they're really something that you should take a look at. You want to be a little off center. If you get to the spot where you hit the center, it will just sit there. It's doing nothing. It's just driving. Once you go a little off center, it gets shaky. So just be very careful with it. Find the center. Slide off the center gently. Now you're in control. So that little bit of shaking around stuff is just something you have to get used to. And
Rick, the question is, do you think there's an advantage using that versus a powered sander instead of the inertia? So powered, is there any advantage, I guess?
It goes a lot faster than most of the drill sanders. And I like it. I got used to it with an Inertia Sander years and years ago.
And you're standing at full throttle, basically?
Yes. So I don't know the speed of that. I don't have a tachometer on it, but I very much enjoy using that. And it has served me extremely well. I did get one of the angle grinder and the 105-degree angle sanders that Ken Rizza has just offered. They're back to the old Sioux, like the old Milwaukee style, and they're relatively cheap. I got it, I tried it, it works great. 700 RPM or something like that, pretty slow. You know, so it's great for doing natural edge bowls and that sort of thing, but I find that this is going much, much faster and does a really nice job. I should try it, but I just do this. There's a little tiny mark in there that I wanted to zip out. It's right about there, so I just kind of oscillate on that spot, sweep all the way through, and I'll check again. Once I don't see any marks, or I see the most minor of marks, just a little tiny touch of a mark there, I'm going to jump up to 150 grit sandpaper. A fresh piece of sandpaper is so much more effective than a used one. And we're going to have to get some dust extraction here. Watch how much dust gets generated with a fresh piece of paper. And we have to inspect again because of the mark. So slight. Now I'm probably overdoing it. Looks great. So now it's polishing 180, 220, and 320. With all this grit
changing. I actually considered making 4 of these. Haven't gotten that crazy yet. And I'm wearing out the back of that one. So I remove any of the older grit, the dust, clear the inside. The pad is slightly warm, not hot. The rim has yet to be sanded. I lost the 320 paper, that's okay. Oh no, that is the 320 paper. Keep it straight. So I've created another little tool rest with my arm. I use the center part of the paper, which I would otherwise not really utilize on these discs. Pop the piece out, grab another one, stick it in and continue.
So what do you think?
There was a question about reverse. You want to spend a minute on how you were approaching that with the lathe on running it reverse?
Mirror, it's exactly the mirror image.
Yeah.
So when the tool rest is straight across the opening of a bowl, one side looks just like the other. I looked in there, I said, oh, that's really rough. I thought I had just sanded it. That's the fresh one. So let's do this on the conventional way. And now that will show the difference really, really well. I will block the view of the camera sometimes. So Mike, do what you can, and everyone will be able to see what they can. You pretty much know what the conventional cut is. It's like this. But I have to reach the tool way over here. I have to get part of my body way over here. So we're going to double check to make sure that it's tight enough, because we've been through that issue before. That feels a little better. The tool rest is at about the same height as I had it before. Now we'll go forward direction, so the wood is coming down on the conventional side, the front of the lathe. And this is a very convenient motion for me to stay right in front of the lathe. So the tool starts here and ends or hits the bottom mark about here, and I can continue to go around the corner until I lose bevel support and have to stop. I flip the tool around the other direction and go this way, and now I'm cutting quite conventionally, but the undercut is an astoundingly difficult thing to do from this direction unless I go to the other side of the lathe, which is possible, but I'd rather turn in reverse, and that problem just goes away. So we're going conventionally. Okay. I know I'll blow it out a little bit. I have to reposition a little. I'll enter the same way by rolling the tool until I get the tip deep inside the bowl, so that I can start going in the conventional direction, sweep around. I have to step back a little bit and look to see where that pencil mark is. I'm bringing the cut
right up to the near, well, it's not a pencil mark, it's the bottom of that, bottom of the Forstner bit hole. Set the tool back inside. If I make an arc that I've gotten pretty familiar with and I finish right up at the bottom of that Forstner bit hole, I can keep going until I lose bevel support. I'm going to do a quick check just to make sure that the wall thickness is good. I'm doing that purely by curvature, and that's very nice.
Roger weighing in says, just bring the headstock down and you don't have to reach over. Bring the headstock down the other end, then you can stand on it.
And he's absolutely right.
Exactly. I just want to make sure he has got his.
But I work on a lathe that doesn't let me move the headstock, so I turn in reverse. It's almost like software. You're using a commercial program, especially like Microsoft. There's one way to do it. There are 2 or 3 other ways to do it. And Mike, and you, and I are all going to have our favorite ways. Gets the job done. And son of a gun, the tool rest is too high again. It just looks a little funny over here on a different lathe rolling. It's a nice piece of equipment, but it's different, and anything different is a little funky. And it's a little dark inside there, but you know, whoops, little tip on the bottom. So even though this is running at 3,000 RPM, the center of this is still feeding the chip very, very slowly into the fluid of the tool. So you have to be patient down here. And I wasn't a moment ago. So there we have it. It's fully sanded. Back to scraping, which is exactly the way we did it before. There's a whole bunch of smuts in there. It's going to come flying out in a minute. Don't be concerned. You won't be able to see everything. Whoa, that's going to be a little sparky. I have to take a much smaller cut so that I don't have a lot of nasty sanding to do. I left a little ridge on there. I didn't finish the cut because I'm going to cut that little ridge away as I shape the rim going in. So I didn't need to come out and have the tool jump out at me. I knew I could stop there, cut that piece off. Let's take a quick check and see how smooth it is. And I have a little tiny ridge down at the very bottom where I have a little scratchiness there. Now I'm a little bit surprised that no one has mentioned anything about the depth of the wall thickness. And let's see, this is what I made. Is that wall thick? I'm asking Roland to compare that wall thickness to the half a hole and see if I hit the profile okay. He's scrutinizing it.
I like it.
And also, let's see the depth of that one. Let's just, because we didn't do this. Ooh, it's maybe a 32nd of an inch less shallow than that one. But it might even be a 32nd of an inch more. Sorry, camera's over here. Yeah, I'm talking to these guys, not you. I apologize. So depth is within the specification. Height, I don't have anything to measure it. It looks close enough. As I say, I get about maybe 1/8 of an inch variation in all of this. So let's check here. And how did we do? Twist it around to see the red mark. You see, I could go ever so slightly more, but I'm within specification, and sanding will take a little tiny bit out. Now, is there any one, oh, and there's a little pip, so I have to do one more scrape. Think for a minute, is there anything else that I did that guided me through this that you didn't see, or that I didn't talk about that you did see? And put it in the chat, and we'll talk about it in just a minute. After I get the pip out of the middle, the high spot in the middle is a very hard thing to sand out. I have to get that just right. And there we go. Yes, very sandable now. So I usually bring the tip of this tool just under the pip, push the handle down until the tip gets to the very dead center of the bowl, then immediately start swinging out, and it leaves a nice feel in the middle. Mike, you're within reach. Can you see the bottom and tell me if that bottom is acceptable?
Nice.
Okay.
Very well done.
I guess that means acceptable. So that's just fine. And we could go through the whole sanding again, and it's probably, sanding is the most boring thing that you can watch, perhaps besides golf. Excuse me if I insult any golfers, but watching golf is darn boring. Playing might be a whole different strategy. So who knows what other trick, it's not really a trick, it's a very good tool. What guide that I used to hit the depth of these bowls seemingly without measuring. Come on.
Did you just come right in with from the Forstner bit? You were using that original line. Right?
So I made a sweep from, let's use the half bowl. I broke the curvature into two pieces. The sweep from the rim down to the bottom of the Forstner bit. So that, and I cut this chunk off the top of it, so it suddenly makes this much smaller. That brings me right down to about here. So, and I get used, I can watch the tip and I can kind of feel what that corner is like, and after you do a couple of them and you miss a little bit, you get a real good feeling for just what that curve is. You hit the bottom of that. Now I continue on and I go a little bit beyond the bottom of the tip of the Forstner bit. So if I see that the tip, there's still a little hole there, I go a little bit farther. But going a little bit farther, how much is a little bit?
As soon as it goes away, right?
Well, as soon as it goes away, but it's probably an eighth of an inch beyond that. So it goes away. If I just shave it off, I can see the tiniest smidgen and I shave it off. Now I still have an eighth of an inch to go. I can guess an eighth of an inch pretty well by coming around the corner and seeing an eighth of an inch tower that gets cut off when I cut that last little pip off. Do you see a little red mark on the tool? That little red dot is the depth mark. And I see half, when I get the tool to the bottom and I bring my head over here, I'm measuring the depth. I should see only half of that red dot. And then I know I'm at the right depth. Set the tool down and go to the scraper. The first 10 or 20 of them I stopped and I measured with this thing, which is very cool. And you can use it for lots of bowls and things. Set the depth, bring it up, find the spot on the back of the bowl where it is, drop it down. It's really, really handy and it doesn't move and wiggle around. I put a red mark on here so that I can set this so that I know that when I'm within specifications. And then it just hit me. I can put red mark on the tool. And then I set this aside. Now that's just for show. I don't use it anymore for, sorry, looking at Rick and not not you guys.
Of the 150, how far along, are you done, or are you still like
I'm at 65.
65? So you're only half
And
way.
it's deliver 100 first and 50 later, because there were so many flaws in the wood that I didn't have enough to set. They gave me a few 150 with enough for a few extras. There were a lot that had cracks in them. With all those cracks, I'm probably going to get 105, but I'm going to promise to deliver 100 in the first batch. Deliver those, get a chunk of wood, and do another 50. They seem to like the design a lot. Part of the beauty of this whole thing was that I got to design the bowl around the specifications of 1.5 inches tall, 3 inches in diameter, and some graceful shape. And I made 3 prototypes and sent them off: open form, a closed form, and a Japanese teacup form. And that in each of those, I made them so that I could use the Forstner bit as a depth stop for each model. And I could use this type of a chuck, although if something flared out a lot, I couldn't use this type chuck. So I didn't give them that option because I didn't want to have to do it that way. It would have meant the third step for the bottom. And as you can imagine, they're not in chunks and chunks of money for these. They want them at a pretty bargain price. So it had to go through pretty easily. So I was able to design into the 3 options that I gave them a process that I knew I could make work. And I practiced a few as I actually made the prototypes and sketched them so that it was something that I knew that I could make. And they chose what I think is actually the prettiest one anyway.
There's 2 questions.
Sure, go ahead.
Matt Newby, for your 45-degree inertia sanders, is the head the only part you got from someone else, and
Yes.
the handle is shop made?
Correct. The handle is mild steel, and I drilled a hole in it. I put a couple set screws in. I didn't drill it on a lathe. I made a jig like this, put my table saw table vertical, clamped it into the table of my drill press, and drilled it as close as I could, which you can get pretty darn close doing it that way. It takes much longer to set it up than it does to take the drilling. But mild steel, oak handle, ferrule, and back here you'll see that there's a nut. It's 1/4-20 on a 1/4 inch shaft, and you have to thread the back of the shaft of your disc. Now, not all of the sanding discs that you get have shafts that are soft enough easily to be tapped. So you have to hunt around and find something that has fairly soft steel. Sometimes they harden them a bit, and it's a real hard job holding on to this and trying to tap put the threads on the outside of that. But once you find a brand, buy a dozen of them and thread them all at once and set them aside, because you will, over time, have to modify them. And that's partly what brought me to this, which originally was purchased with a foam pad glued to it with the Velcro on it, and it got worn out. And I just mounted it in the chuck of the lathe and trimmed it off, made it nice and smooth, put new Velcro on this part, and now the interface pads can be used, and you can easily change the size of these interface pads by putting them between 2 little blocks of wood on the lathe and cut it with a skew chisel. You cut right through the Velcro and the foam. It's so easy, you can make any size you want. And so this is 2 inches, fairly standard 2-inch interface pad. This is probably the same or very similar brand disc that has the original foam on it that's gotten so worn out that I had to reinforce it with epoxy. I've reinforced it with rubber cement in the past, and that works, but for about 4 or 5 bowls, and then you have to apply more because it's so gummy. And I put epoxy on it, and I try to make it fairly thick at the back end and very thin at the front. And I just put a layer on before I came here tonight, and it was a little bit too stiff, and you see that I just had to loosen it up and get some squish into this pad so that it could work on the inside. And this I trimmed down to smaller than 2 inches so that when you put the 2-inch pad on it, so the 2-inch pad will fit on the 2-inch sander with just the little ears going over the edge. But this is a little bit too big to get into this particular hole. And an 1.75" pad fits perfectly in here. I have a couple that are smaller and they work too, but the biggest one that you can use gives you the biggest ring on sandpaper, which means there's more grit to be used in sanding the inside. So the bigger the piece, the more grit that gets used, the longer the piece of sandpaper lasts. Something else, Mike?
Can you talk about how you constructed the wooden chuck jaws?
Ah, yes. Let's take this apart and do that right now.
He's waiting to get the flat jaws.
From one way.
Oh, they just make flat jaws like that?
Yeah, a number of companies make what they call flat jaws.
Okay.
And
So I can do whatever I want.
absolutely,
Okay.
you can put anything you want on them. So we have to find the Allen wrench so that I can take this. Well, first, take the bowl out. The jaws are accessories. The true jaws of the chuck are inside. And you see the 2 screws that go into, cap screws that go into the jaws. Do you have a chuck jaw, a small one of any type, let's say 2-inch, that we can use as a comparison with Roland? I've sent Roland on so many missions tonight to find things, and he's come up with every one of them. Okay, if you hand me that, just as it is, you can see a one-way stronghold chuck, the big brother to the Talon chuck, and you see the 2 fasteners that hold the typical chuck jaw on here. If you slice this part off, extended it a little bit, put 3 extra holes in here, you can then screw a block of wood onto the flat jaw. And that is what we have here. I'll show you the back side of it in just a moment as the chuck comes off of the lathe. Meaning that we are almost done. So now you can see the typical jaws come out to approximately the diameter of the chuck body, and here the flat jaws come out beyond the chuck diameter. And there are 3 screws that you just use to attach a chunk of wood to this. I took 4 square blocks of poplar. I find that poplar is the superior wood for doing this. It doesn't have a coarse grain. It doesn't have hard winter growth rings. It's just generally bland, plain, relatively soft wood that is very, very good at not marring the pieces that you grip with it. So I did the first ones with a piece of framing timber, spruce, I think, and I gripped a couple things and I saw the grain pattern of the spruce imprinted in, I think, cherry. So the winter growth rings of spruce are hard enough to damage cherry. It didn't damage sugar maple. And this is beech, which is hard like sugar maple. But I put cherry in this and it does just fine. Also, you'll see just a couple little burn marks here. I had a couple pieces slip in it. So you see the dark color of the, let's see if I can find a white spot. No, all the burn marks are all in the dark part of the poplar. That brown is just a little bit of a burn mark, and it did burn a bowl that slipped. It was too loose. I had a little catch, and for a fraction of a second, the bowl stops turning, and the chuck kept going at 3,000 RPM. That definitely makes a little burn mark. But very trivial. I didn't sand it. I didn't do anything. I just continued to use it. was fine. So what I'll often do is take a plank of poplar and run it through the planer, dimension it, line it up, cut perfect squares, close the jaws of this chuck, align the perfect squares. I'll first nick out one little corner so that I can see a hole right down the middle, get them aligned, turn it over, put all 12 screws in, slide it open, slide it closed, and then I won't have the gaps here. On this piece, it was 4 clumsy little pieces of poplar that they were too small. They were scraps. I pulled them out of the kindling pile because I usually have bunches of poplar hanging around, and I was very, very short, and I just had these 4 pieces, and I hand planed a face and an edge, and that's all I had was the face to go down on the chuck and the edge to go over here, and a chop saw cut to make it square. And a couple of them were a little bit off, and I had to trim them. So this one looks ugly, but if you make perfect squares, you put them together, screw it up, and it's really nice. Even if, I mean, the pieces don't have to touch each other, they just have to touch the piece that you're working on. It's best if you make it work so that the chuck is nearly closed when it's holding your piece, because you get the most grip possible. And I've used this for many, many things, and it works extremely well. Anything else?
I got one last question. What finish are you using?
Tried and true linseed oil. Just linseed oil, because that's what the client requested. So it was easy enough. Now, I asked a question, does anyone have a favorite sanding disc based on its capability as well as the longevity? In fact, we can unmute and we can start chit-chatting, because for all practical purposes, it's only 8:30, but we're done. Good job. I've never finished a demo so soon.
Do those flat jaws come in different sizes?
I suppose if you used cold jaws without the buttons, you could have different sizes. I believe it.
I could just use the cold jaw, I thought.
In fact, the first time I did it, I bolted pieces of wood to cold jaws.
Okay, are you doing that, Mike?
Yeah.
Didn't know where they are. Where is it?
And it worked really well.
They didn't participate.
They can unmute themselves. You should be able to.
So if you have a question, you can unmute yourself. We've taken that button off, I believe.
To answer the question about the sandpaper, I use cling spore and have good luck with it.
What brand of the cling spore paper? What model? Do they give it a specific name, or is it just cling spore hook and loop?
I honestly don't remember.
Okay. I've had some pretty good luck with that too.
Like Norton.
Norton makes some pretty good paper. Roland's pulling one out. Which one is this? These are really nice. The A275. These are,
I use them sparingly. I use them for special events.
oh, these are great. Just use them. They're
Oh yeah,
fabulous.
except they're expensive.
Yeah, they're a bit expensive. A275 is a standard in the industry. It's a really pretty good paper. It works extremely well. It's not the longest lasting paper that I've ever used. There's a company called Indasa, I-N-D-A-S-A, and I find that their paper lasts at least 50% longer than these. How much per disc?
I don't remember.
And I'm going to get some, and I'm doing an evaluation, because as I was going through this, doing bowl after bowl and all of these pieces, and I looked in my sandpaper box, I was pulling out sandpaper, a couple pieces that I've had for years. And a couple of them, I don't even remember what brand they are. And I was finding that the cheap ones wear out quickly. And the expensive ones last pretty well. And the really expensive ones last about the same. You know, that there are really pricey sandpapers that aren't giving you a whole lot more. And this
Those are
old,
good too.
and it,
He's from Georgia.
yes, Vince's Wooden Wonders. These are the, oh, I haven't used these, the green one. Now, what I will say about the film discs is that they work extremely well on the outside. I don't like to use them on the inside because they don't flex like a cloth does. If I take this is Mylar backed, it's plastic, it's polyester, and if I try to push this into a concave cup, it's going to do a fold there. So if you want to use this, there's yes, my secret reserve stash has a particular way to modify that. If you go to the back and cut with a utility knife and make little flaps, then the film backed paper goes inside a bowl. But use the smallest disc that you can, otherwise it will start to fold. If the radius is too small and this is still big and you cut these to fit the sand pad, you really have to cut these to fit the radius of the bowl, not the sanding pad. And so you might have to cut them a little bit deeper to keep it from folding even right here. And that means going to a smaller sanding pad. Let this wrap around the sanding pad.
If your sanding pad has a radius on it already,
Those are wonderful.
then, because I have them in the box.
Yep.
But that will let that conform to that shape.
Right, and if you want to make your own sanding pads, I found that you can cut the sanding pad very nicely with a skew chisel. You aim and you just cut right through, and you cut through the Mylar, or sorry, not the Mylar, the Velcro, which is kind of easy to go through because it's kind of hard. And then you're into the punkiest stuff you'll ever cut in your world. It's like cutting marshmallow. But the tool is now aimed and it starts cutting through nicely, and then it hits the last piece of the Mylar that set again, hits the last piece of the Velcro, and it cuts through nice and smooth again. And sometimes it's just a little bit ragged and you put some glue on the outside and get it all back. But how do you make a radius one? I can't cut a radius through that. I can only do the straight one. So that's when you use a power sander. You can spin this thing up and it stretches the foam out, and you use a power sander and you can do the radius. And radius pads are really kind of neat. Thank you. Thank you for that. All right, anything else?
The question is, the main reason sandpaper wears out is because the intricate areas get loaded with sanding dust, or is it more that the grit gets pulled off during sanding?
The grit gets worn away.
Yeah.
These sandpapers don't load up.
So this is Matt Nubia. He sticks to blowing the paper off as well. So you were blowing your piece.
But at the high speed and very light touch. Right. You didn't see, you can look at, well, okay. Yeah, I'm making a mess here. So, yes, I slightly loaded the paper, but it's still pretty workable. So it's not glazed over. It's just a little bit dirty. And I won't clean this with a brass brush or something. I feel the center where I can feel the aggressive good grit. And then I feel here where I've kind of overused it. And then I feel over here where the piece is flexing around the edge of the pad that bends. And when I'm using this portion, I'm getting the lightest touch, and I never load the paper there. And that's where I do all the finish sanding on this. So a light touch, if you sand very fast, you have to use a light touch. If you go very slowly, you can have a much more aggressive touch. So when I'm sanding the bottom of this by hand with my finger, I'm absolutely pushing hard, and I'm actually feeling for that grit to be doing the cutting. And the moment that I don't feel that anymore, I just slide over to new place. I use the sandpaper when it's basically brand new. I'll use it for just a few seconds, 10, 15 seconds, and I'm done with that spot on the paper because it's starting to burnish. And I don't want to spend a lot of time with worn sandpaper when I can go to a new sheet and save a lot of time, which is when I'm actually selling something. The time that I save can be calculated into the amount of sandpaper that gets used. And I'm using more sandpaper than I calculated when I priced this job. It's true. But it saves a lot of time, and still it's kind of worth it. Especially since I'm using up a lot of old sandpaper in my kit, and now I'm going to go buy a couple boxes of good stuff by the 25 or 50 at a time, and pay the full price. And when I buy sandpaper, it's never under a few $100. I get just a bunch. Well, and then I don't have to do it for a few years, because I just get a whole bunch that I know is going to work.
All right. Does anybody else have anything for Rick as far as questions are concerned? Other than that, then that concludes the demo for tonight.